Who doesn't say that Trump is post-truth? But it's different.
Post-truth.
Post-truth is everywhere. Get with the program. Post-truth is everywhere. But you might say people are post-truth for two reasons. People say Trump lies all the time.
Yeah,
okay, Trump lies all the time. But the sophisticated commentariat also says very often that we're in a post-truth age. And they'll say that not just because Trump lies, but because there are some authoritarian ideologues like Putin in Russia and Trump in the States and circles around them who no longer believe in the existence of truth. So to them, you don't even make a distinction between truth and lie, because to call something a lie already implies that it defines it in relationship to the truth. If you've rejected something like the truth, then you no longer have its opposite in this sense, the lie. So they just are like, all that exists is what you stipulate, basically. So it's post-truth in that sense.
So is it like the different description of the same event? Like Fox will highlight the story in one way?
No, so you're pre-postmodern. You still think that...
Am I orthodox or what?
No, you're not orthodox. Don't flatter yourself. You're pre-postmodern. So you still think there can be something like the same event. So a postmodern thinker would say, I realize I'm simplifying, okay?
Are they crazy?
No, they're not crazy. They're not crazy. So we have to separate between the pathetic imitators who don't know the fundamental arguments and the sophisticated theorists who do know the fundamental arguments. Okay? In the end, it's for you to decide whether they're all charlatans or not. But no, they're not crazy. So what I'm saying is, a lot of these people read a lot of these great theorists. Okay, a lot of them are French, where philosophy means a lot more in the French curriculum than it does in the American one. And, it could be, you would have to be ashamed of yourself never to have read at least some parts of Heidegger and other philosophers indebted to him. But if they dispute, for example, that there can be such a thing as the same event. So here's what I have learned. Here's what I've learned. I used to think in my undergraduate years, postmodernist people are complete idiots. They're just jokers. They're fakers. Everything they say is self-refuting. You don't even bother reading it. Don't even bother thinking about it. It's just pomo garbage. There's nothing to it. Because I had an influential first philosophy professor who set me on one path and kind of taught me to distrust me and the rest of his students to distrust postmodernism. He was doing what he thought was his own civic duty in that case.
Indoctrination.
Yeah, indoctrination to a certain extent. Again, professors have a civic duty, but he cautioned us against self-refutations of postmodernism. But gradually, you form your own thoughts on these matters. And as I've said time and time again in my previous videos, and as I now must say once more, to recognize, let's say, Derrida's brilliance, or to recognize the many ways in which he's making genuinely valid points, to learn and to have your whole outlook be informed, to learn. I assume that's what an education is about. You learn. You can't come out the same way you came in. There's the story of Rabbi Akiva, who went, a Jewish sage among a number of other Jewish sages who had a mystical vision, and one person, never came out of this mystical vision. Another person came out and went crazy. Another person, I don't know, nobody ever heard from again, but Rabbi Akiva, he had the vision and he came out and he was still himself. Well, you can have the experience and remain yourself, but you shouldn't really, in my view, in the course of an education, come out exactly the same way you came in, because you should have learned something. So in the course of my education, I learned to give way more credit to at least Derrida, but not only Zizek you can learn from, and these other thinkers you can learn from. But here's the point. To give them credit doesn't mean to become their lapdogs or their ideologues. You learn from Carl Schmitt, Heidegger, Leo Strauss. You read these things and learn from them. It doesn't mean that you're an apologist for them. It doesn't mean that you become a slave to them. But I've said that before. There's no need to belabor the point here. So you're pre-postmodern when you think there can be something as the same event. when it comes to human affairs and human existence. So a lot of it,
Get with the program now.
Listen, a lot of the program has to do with this. Okay. If I was teaching somebody to try to have for themselves the insight that makes Heidegger comprehensible to them, okay? It's not just an additional piece of knowledge that you put in your head. It has to be a change of perspective. It has to be some kind of reorientation of your outlook for a minute. So,
right. I can understand that.
So what's something about yourself that you take for granted? Are you an individual?
Yeah.
You're an individual. Okay. Do you take that for granted about yourself?
I guess so, yeah.
Okay.
I don't really question that, so yeah.
You don't question it, and do you assent to the statement that you are an individual? Okay, yeah. So there's a statement about yourself, about your being.
Mm-hmm.
I am an individual. So not just the property or characteristic that you have, like I have brown curly hair or whatever the case might be, right? It's on a different level of yourself. It's a statement about yourself.
Mm-hmm.
You made it easier on me by already saying you don't question it. Well, there's no philosophical inquiry into selfhood without questioning the self. But okay, you're an individual. So what does it mean to be an individual? And where do you derive the concept of individuality from as you apply it to yourself?
And that's a good question.
Yeah, it is a good question. So one of the basic experiences that you go through in a philosophical education is noticing that the things that you take for granted about yourself are questionable, and that you start, I'm not saying you're not an individual. I'm not saying that you're not an individual. But I'm saying the statement, I'm an individual, is an interpretation of the nature of your existence. So what kind of being must you be to have an interpretation of your own existence? That's already one step past the question, are you an individual? You see it? You see what I'm saying? So to move from like classical, classical liberalism, I'm an individualist and I'm for smaller government because I think human beings can make their own decisions, and I think that we know better for ourselves what we want than the government knows for us, and we just want good jobs and lower taxes and no borders, no country. Like, okay, take all whatever that is, okay? Sure. Take any, or you say no, more power to the workers, because the workers are not capital but labor. Labor is what builds this country.
That sounds good too.
But they all sound good the more you understand them. But all of them are interpretations about the nature of human existence, including the claim, I'm an individual. So we have to have some account of ourselves as beings that interpret ourselves. So we're already one step closer to Heidegger's world. We're a self-interpreting being. Well, where do we get the concepts for our self-interpretation? The recognition that you are a self-interpreting being already brings you one step closer to an understanding of Heidegger. So you're no longer just taking yourself for granted as an individual or as something else. You're now subjecting yourself to this process of not just who am I really? Who am I really? Kind of, but with greater philosophical sophistication. So with some attention to how philosophers tend to produce the concepts with which we interpret ourselves. That's also interesting for Heidegger. So all of that comes into play. And
tell me about the individual. Where does that come from? You can't just give me an example and not expect me to go deep into that example.
Okay, I don't want to go too deep into it with you.
Fair. Just tell me where that comes from.
Let's say one way you could look at it is this, that, let me just ask you. So when you say about yourself that you're an individual, what do you mean by that? Like, what characterizes being an individual?
Wouldn't you know better?
Well, but you call yourself an individual.
Yes, I would say that I characterize myself as someone with, to whatever extent, my own thoughts, my own desires, my own, I wanted to say being, but then kind of probably would dig myself a grave here.
Yeah, okay, so somehow when we think about ourselves as individuals, it already implies some notion of being, thoughts, of what it is to have thoughts, of what it means to call those thoughts your own thoughts.
Yeah.
So there's already having, ownership, thinking, desiring, and being in some configuration. We could go further into any of these. So what does it mean to quote unquote have your own thoughts? How much have you monitored what you call your thinking to confirm that those thoughts are your own? Do you mean that they've passed through your head and in that sense are yours? Or do you mean that you are generating them? That you are thinking thoughts that other people haven't thought before? So we don't have to go down the road of all of these types of questions. My point...
I need a drink.
The main point here is just that you can't dismiss. So the main point here is just that there's something to learn from Heidegger, and there's something to learn from the people who read him and write about him. And even though he's had his greatest impact at the universities on the left, he doesn't. That's not his natural home politically. As you know, he's a member of the Nazi Party and other things. But it's also not his natural home philosophically, because, as I said, the left only takes his views on the end of the history of philosophy and doesn't take his views on the beginning of a new beginning of philosophy. Well, there's one political philosopher who does take into account Heidegger's views of another beginning of philosophy. And in fact, he's got a book on Heidegger called Martin Heidegger, The Philosophy of Another Beginning, where this idea of a new inception of philosophy is at the center of this person's understanding of Heidegger. Well, that's Alexander Dugin. So Alexander Dugin, whatever else he might be to people, is somebody who's taken Heidegger seriously enough to make sense of Heidegger's view of a new beginning, as opposed to only reading Heidegger from the left.
I needed more.
So you have Heidegger, you have the people on the left who have had an impact at the university level, the Heideggerianization of the left together with the Nietzscheanization of the left. You have Alexander Dugin's one of the only sophisticated political accounts of the new inception of philosophy that Heidegger writes about. Reading Heidegger does not make you a Nazi. Reading Dugin does not make you hate Ukrainians or anybody else. Now, that's not to say that there's no relationship between the philosophy and a political outlook, even if it may not be. So the fear, but as I said, I had snowflake professors who wanted a safer space for themselves. Keep Heidegger far away. Keep Dugin far away.
You know what you
keep Millerman far away.
What about the snowflake TAs?
About the snowflake TAs.
Because you had two.
You know, I didn't have that many. I don't even want to say. Oh, okay, fine. As I said, teaching assistants, they can pick how they teach their courses. Mm-hmm. And you were asking me if I'm always championing Marx when we're teaching Marx, am I not indoctrinating the students? Mm-hmm. And I said, not if the syllabus includes alternatives, because then the students are presented with the alternatives. If the syllabus doesn't present alternatives, then I choose to supplement my presentation of the authors with potential critiques. Yeah, with potential criticisms, so that I make sure the students are exposed. Even if the professor didn't plan for the students to be exposed to alternative perspectives, I ensure that the students were exposed to alternate perspectives. And my students seemed to appreciate that, even though the vast majority of them were The vast majority of them who cared about any of these issues were sooner on the left than on the right, but they all appreciated my willingness to present a range of arguments and counter arguments. I was never a propagandist in class, just a teacher. Thank you. Because I thought the most important thing to do for the students was to make sure that they understand the basic concepts, I constantly reiterated the basic concepts in as many ways as I could do. Well, I took great pride in talking to the class, like trying to present ideas super clearly as I could. So I shared my notes with my class. That way they wouldn't have to write it down as I was talking. That way they could have it as a study guide, or they could have it to think about it. They could follow up with me about it. I made notes for the tutorial, and I shared my tutorial notes with my class. Mm-hmm. And I did that for years, and my students seemed to love it. I had a website specifically for my students, and I would post my tutorial notes on the website for them, together with a lot of other things. Like if I mentioned an article, I'd post a link to the article.
Was it an open website?
It was an open website, but only they had the link. But,
right.
It was an open website. There was no password to get in. So one day I heard that the notes that I'd made for class were circulated. Well, I told you that I had about 60 students, but there were about 1,000 students in the class. So that means my tutorial notes for the 60 students were circulated to 1,000 students. Now I thought, that's amazing. That's great, because it's a good resource. It's not a cheat sheet. Mm-hmm. It's to help them understand.
Yeah.
You see, they couldn't put it in their pockets or write it on the backs of their hand and do well in the class. It's a continuation of what a teaching assistant or professor has to do anyways. So what does a teaching assistant or professor has to do? Teach the material as best as you can. How do you teach it? You talk about it, you write it on the board, you ask questions, you discuss, you field questions. You do everything you can do in your power in the time that you have with the students to try to help them understand.
Right.
You can't force it into their heads. They say about taking the horse to water, but you can't make it drink. But you've got to take it to the water. So you take it to the water. You give them every explanation. And for the people who are visual, you draw it on the board. And for the people who are, something else, you use kind of vivid examples. And for the people who are half asleep, you bang the desk, and raise your voice, and wake them up. So everything that I could do, I did, including these notes. They circulated, and then one day the professor wrote to me, I heard that have you been sharing your notes with your students? Can you explain to me what your reasoning was? And I explained to her what I just have explained to you. And she said, well, how could you do such a thing? How could you be such an idiot? Don't you understand what you're doing? Basically, she was very upset. The professor was very upset. The professor did not see things the way that I saw them when it comes to sharing my notes with the students.
Okay, goes without saying she didn't actually call you an idiot.
She didn't call me an idiot, but she very nearly did. So she was upset that I was sharing my notes with the students. She clearly saw her role as an educator differently than I did. Okay, that's all right. She said, would you please take them down? Not a problem. She's the professor. I'm the TA. I took them down. I didn't like some of the bickering. I didn't like some of the innuendo and things like that. But it's not a problem. The moment she asked me to take them down, I did. But what I found out was that one of the other TAs had ratted me out and said, there's another TA, me, who's sharing his notes with the students. Going above and beyond what most TAs are expected to do. And she said something along the lines, I can't even remember who she said this to or how it got around to me, but she said it's not fair to the other TAs if one TA is excellent, something like that. In other words, what she was saying was, let's all have a race to the bottom and do the least that's expected of us. Just have the students talk amongst themselves and don't even try to offer them anything. It's not fair to the other TAs if one of TA is sharing his notes with the students and the other TAs aren't. My view is that If you don't think that's fair, you should raise your game. Ask me for my notes. Work with somebody else. Figure out your own method. But if you don't think it's fair, you shouldn't drag everybody down to your level. If you think that someone's doing something better than you, you should make an effort to get up rather than tear them down. So that was the pettiest TA moment. Let that be the worst of your problems, right? Like, that was the pettiest TA moment that I had in 5 years, when I found out that a TA was unhappy with, not just unhappy with the fact that I was sharing my notes with my students and ratting me out, and was supported by the professor.
This is what I'm surprised by. I'm not surprised about other TAs bickering about,
Here's the thing.
But why the professor reacted in such a way?
I'll tell you this. The next semester, a different professor replaced that one, by design.
Mm-hmm.
And I emailed him and I said, hey, look, Mr. Professor man, you should know that I'm a problem child TA. I've been sharing my notes. And I was doing it under the last professor, and she didn't like it. She came down on me hard, and I just kind of want I'm not going to share my notes with any students this year, but I kind of want to hear from you what your thoughts about this are. And he took a completely different approach, a much better one, I thought. He said, your view of teaching is exactly the same as mine. I think that we should do everything we can do in our power to make sure that students understand as much as they can understand. But I think, he said, that students will gain a lot from having to write this out themselves, as opposed to having it written for them by you. And so even though I support...
Like learning how to summarize.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, exactly.
And write quick notes.
Even though it's in the right spirit of things to want to give them my tutorial notes, I'm depriving them of something that they can genuinely gain from them for themselves by trying to do their own summaries. And that's a totally sensible point, yeah. Okay? But it's a different argument than if one TA is going above and beyond, then everybody has to go above and beyond. And it's not fair to the pathetic TAs amongst us if somebody is just doing his job right. Anyways, most of the TAs in my 5 years that I didn't listen, I was pretty much, I didn't interact with a lot of them, to be fair. Many of them went about their own business as I went about mine. And many of them I like and respect, and they're friends of mine, maybe watching this video. So I was lucky,
Hi, Igor.
Yeah. So let that be the worst of your problems if in 5 years at a job site you only have 1 or 2 coworkers who give you a little bit of a headache. So the students, I didn't experience any snowflakes. The TAs, 1 or 2 at worst. The professors, oh man, there's no hope for the professors. There's no hope.
Don't you want to be a professor?
I'm just kidding. There's a lot. As upset as I was at the 4 professors who quit my committee, and I had a bunch of other professors of whom I have a low opinion for various reasons, there were a lot of professors who definitely, not a lot, there were a handful of professors who earned their place at the university, behaved like educators, stood up for principle, had a spine, were good at what they did, were good supervisors, good people. So the supervisor who supervised my dissertation, so I told you that my first supervisor, Ronald Biener, quit my committee and then went on to write that book, Dangerous Minds, Heidegger, Nietzsche, and the Return of the Far Right. Which circles did this book become popular in? Well, I'll tell you in a second, but I have to say the supervisor who replaced him, the supervisor who stayed on my committee till the end, I won't name names. I won't name her name because I don't want to, you never know. But Ruth Marshall, one of the best, truly one of the best. So there you go. There were some professors who were worthy of the title, and some who were, I thought their conduct was not so good. But Biener, to his, you gotta say this about Ronald Biener. He had an issue with the fact that I was working on Alexander Dugin, because Dugin is published by Arctos, and Arctos is Richard Spencer, and Richard Spencer was married to Nina Kuprianova, and Nina Kuprianova was translating for Dugin. You connect the networks, and pretty soon you'll go crazy. So he had an issue with all of that, and people can have an issue with that. That's fine. It's a bit different when you're a professor of political theory, I think. But he had an issue with that, and he wrote a book. He wrote a book arguing that Nietzsche and Heidegger are having this resurgence in the minds of American white nationalists and Russian neo-Nazis and little Millermans running around the university becoming fascist propagandists.
It's really hard to picture as a little man, 6'8" person. Yeah. But was it published by an academic press?
You out there in YouTube land and wherever else you may be watching this, you must understand that under this calm, sensible, moderate demeanor, there's truly a malicious far-right propagandist, according to the National Post and some of the professors in my department. So, listen, there's legitimate cause for concern when you have this question that Ronald Biener wrote in an article for the Chronicle of Higher Education. The article was called "When Neo-Nazis Love Your Book," because the first review of his book was written by a website on the far right. It's caught him probably by surprise. And in this Chronicle of Higher Education article, he raises a fair question, which is, in the classroom, when you're teaching alternatives to liberal democracy, which on one hand you have to do if you're trying to teach people and not just indoctrinate them, how as an educator can you do that responsibly? How can you teach people, for example, a criticism of morality without pushing them off the cliff towards immorality? How can you let them know that there have been other opinions about the best political regime or about the nature of political life without inadvertently making those alternatives overly appealing to them? He makes a big deal of the fact that Richard Spencer says he was, quote unquote, red-pilled by Nietzsche. So he took a philosophy class, the philosophy professor taught Nietzsche, and yada, yada, yada. Richard Spencer is saying Heil Trump. So he's worried that educators can have an influence on their students that is the opposite of what civic education should be. Civic education should teach students to have respect for their own regime's principles. Like, for example, civic education in Canada means you should have respect for Canadian institutions. You should have a knowledge about Canadian institutions, Canadian history. You should have respect for Canadian institutions and Canadian history, and so on in every other regime. But if you start teaching the alternatives, there's the risk that you'll push the students toward those alternatives. But that's a genuine problem. I think he's right to have identified it. All of you who are watching this ought to think about it. Even read his book if you think it'll be helpful. I have my thoughts on the matter, as you can imagine, that go beyond the scope of this video. But it's a problem if in education, this is what I want to end this video on. So the relationship between education and indoctrination in the university. The university has a place, and when I talk about the university again, I mean the humanities and social sciences. I mean political science, philosophy, social science, things like that. I'm leaving to the side the sciences and other such disciplines. The university should not be a place of unrestricted free speech, always and under all circumstances. Well, I'm not sure that's right. What I want to say, I want to say it differently. I want to say that there's a place for civic education in the university. And if you equate civic education with indoctrination or propaganda, because you're teaching people to have, you're teaching people not to view your own country's principles as equal to other countries' principles, but as more valuable. So you're giving people a civic education, teaching them that the rule of law is better than the absence of a rule of law. A constitutional regime is better than a regime with no constitution. That the rights and liberties we protect are better than other governments that trample over those rights and liberties. And even teaching them that our failings do not mean that we are morally unworthy. They just mean that we have high ideals that sometimes we fall from, because everybody's imperfect or whatever. instilling in people a sense of respect for their own government and for their own political principles is a legitimate function of the university, I think. So
your mother-in-law still quotes.
Yes, exactly. My Soviet mother-in-law still quotes the education that she received in the Soviet Union. Bumper sticker Marxism, which is fine.
Yeah, but her
but
grandchildren.
I want to, yeah. But I just want to be clear about that.
She didn't
Political
indoctrinate
science,
you?
a course in political science at the University of Toronto should teach something about the Canadian regime. And it should not just teach it, but it should teach and defend the principles of the Canadian regime. And if it teaches alternatives, which it should do, it should first have set up the case in favor of the Canadian regime. And if it teaches the alternatives fairly, it shouldn't do so as an enemy of the Canadian regime. In other words, educators at the university have a task in forming the civic character of the university students. And that's incompatible with bashing, your own regime, whether it's from the left or whether it's from the right. And it's incompatible with trying to push your students too far to the left or too far to the right. But by the same token, it's unforgivable if the university does not have a home for free speculation on the best regime. There should be at least somewhere in the university, or let me put it differently, there should be at least somewhere in the university where you don't have to worry about civic, how should I put it, about being a good citizen, about flattering your regime, about defending your laws, about puffing yourself up and putting everybody else down. I don't mean there should be somewhere at the university where you get leftist propaganda or rightist propaganda. I mean, there should be at least somewhere in the university where you can just think freely and let your thought go beyond the bounds of your political party, beyond the bounds of your country, beyond the bounds of any identity that you might think that you have. There should be somewhere where you're free to let your thought exceed the way that it does limitations that are imposed on it, including patriotic limitations, ideological limitations, even moral limitations. There should be a place where you can think beyond the confines of whatever you think is a moral dictate. Even if most of the university is dedicated to civic education, to the formation of the characters of the students, it has to, your whole body is not your brain, but there's a place in your body for your brain. The whole university does not have to be free inquiry and free speech, but there must be a place in the university for free inquiry and free speech.
You know what it reminds me? Soviet Union kitchen conversations, the разговоры по душам. There's no censorship there. This used to be, right?
Yeah.
In the time of censorship of all the public spaces, within all the public spaces. It was the privacy of your small kitchen table where you could actually gather with your friends.
With mangoes and sunflower seeds and wine. That's just what we have on the table here. So Lola's saying, if you didn't hear, that in the Soviet Union, it's conversations at the kitchen table where the heart-to-heart, where the ideological masks dropped, or at least the place where they might drop, and you might have a heart-to-heart, and you might get behind the ideology. So we don't want our universities to become like in the Soviet Union, where you know that you're not going to have a heart-to-heart or a free inquiry at the university. You're only going to have it in the privacy of your own home around the kitchen table. Maybe we do want that. Maybe it's going to go that way. I don't know. But there's still room to defend the university as a place where we don't want, I hope we don't want our universities to become analogous to the Soviet censorship of thought and to the pushing everything to the boundaries of the private discussions of the home. This is a plea to save some part of the university from ideological takeover, whatever ideology it happens to be. But things can be much worse than a heart-to-heart conversation in the kitchen with the people you love, because that's where we're recording this with my wife Lola. So thank you for watching. That's all for tonight. Follow me on Twitter. Sign up for more videos if you liked this. Please share. with your friends, and until next time. Wait.
No.